Hey US history class, Mr. Sharon here. As we have a test on the Cold War coming up, and one of the assignments was this two nations live on the edge, I just wanted to give a really brief overview of some of the key concepts from this, just in case anyone was struggling from the reading. I know on a couple of the questions in the reading there was kind of a lack of explanation because we switched from an old book to a new book a couple of years ago. So I'll explain some of these topics a little more in detail in case you didn't understand them. So taking a look at this PowerPoint, two nations live on the edge. Obviously on the top we have the American flag, and in the context of this Cold War, keep in mind the United States represents the free world, a democracy where people can choose their leaders, where people can participate in their government, where you can open your own businesses, you have rights and freedoms. On the bottom you have the Soviet flag, that communist symbol, which was common among all communist nations. They all had a very similar flag with the red backdrop with the yellow hammer and the sickle. And the Soviet Union and communism in general, everywhere it was developed, stood for dictatorships, a lack of freedom and rights, the government owning all businesses, the government really controlling the entire economy and telling you what you can and what you can't do with your life. It's kind of ironic because with all the restrictions that we're currently seeing right now with COVID-19, we're getting a little taste of what it would be like to live in a communist nation where your government tells you, hey, you're not allowed to go outside of your house, you're not allowed to gather in groups of more than 10 people, things like that. And I'm not saying that the United States or any other countries that are doing this right now should be labeled as communist. There's a good reason why we're doing this. We're only restricting rights and freedoms right now temporarily out of necessity. If you live in a communist nation, you're living this 24/7, not just out of necessity, just all the time, because that's how your government wants you to live with no rights or freedom. So it's a very scary thing. And there's a very important reason why we tried to fight against this for many years. So a couple key developments that happened, and this goes over the 1950s mainly. So the Soviet Union explodes its first atomic bomb in 1949. Because of that, the United States figures we have to keep one leg up on the Soviet Union. We feel a lot of pressure to create something that's even more powerful than the atomic bomb. So we create a new type of nuclear weapon using a different type of technology. It's called the hydrogen bomb, better known as the H-bomb. And H-bombs are pretty crazy when you look at the magnitude of what they can do, the type of death and destruction they can bring. So we developed ours in 1952. At this point, the Soviets are right behind everything we do. As soon as we develop a new weapon, the Soviets are right behind, so it only takes them a year at this point. With the A-bomb, it took them 4 years to figure out how to make one after we did our first successful test, even though they had spies in the Manhattan Project. By this point, they are much closer to where we're at in all of our developments, which is very scary for the Cold War. If you look down at the bottom here, just to give you an idea, so in the bottom left, you'll see a circle, and then that circle is enlarged at the very bottom left of your screen. So if you see this one graph that has Mike, Bravo, and Tsar Bomba, so these are this is the measurement of an explosion, a detonation from a nuclear weapon in terms of megatons. So there are 1,000 kilotons in a megaton, in a single megaton. So just to put this in perspective, the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are still the only two nuclear weapons that were ever used against people in a state of war, all the other nuclear weapons that were ever detonated were only tests in the 70 plus years they've been around. Hiroshima was roughly 15 kilotons. So you look at some of these other bombs, Mike, Bravo, and Tsar Bomba, all being hydrogen bombs, not atomic bombs, and they are exponentially more powerful than what we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And those two little bombs we dropped killed hundreds of thousands of people. So you can only imagine when you look at this graph, Tsar Bomba versus Hiroshima, which is just like a little tiny ant compared to a mountain, what Tsar Bomba could do. So Tsar Bomba was actually the most powerful H-bomb that was ever detonated, and I believe that was in roughly 1962. It was in the early 1960s. So the Soviet Union detonated that, and it was a 50 megaton explosion. Just to put this in perspective, the blast was so powerful that it could break glass, it could break windows 60 miles away from where the explosion took place. So looking at it, to make it relevant to Thompson, I believe Boston is about 60 miles away from Thompson. So imagine a hydrogen bomb being dropped on Boston. All of the windows in our school would potentially be blown in all the way down in Thompson from the power of that blast. To put it in more perspective, I found this little image of New York City. And we know that New York City has, I believe it's roughly around 10 million people in that New York City area. Right in the middle there is Manhattan. So if we ever got into a nuclear war, and if an 800 kiloton nuclear warhead was detonated like smack dab in the middle of New York City, pretty much all of Manhattan would be taken out. There would be millions of people. And you can see this image here. It shows no survivors in that immediate zone, and then there's that outer zone. Now keep this in mind, that this is an 800 kiloton nuclear warhead. Tsar Bomba was roughly, if I'm doing my math correctly, 60 times more powerful than the bomb that would be detonated in this scenario. So that's really scary, and this is why over the years nations have created a lot of treaties to try to cut down on nuclear weapon production, and we've done everything possible to make sure that we don't get into a conflict where we have to use these things, because the fatalities would just be absolutely jaw-dropping and terrifying. This whole policy where throughout the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union made as many nuclear weapons as they could, and they made them as powerful as they could. This policy was called brinkmanship. So the United States figured that creating these deadly weapons was actually a way to keep us out of war. Because if we were willing to go to the edge of all-out war, that message became very clear to other countries like the Soviet Union. And even though they were producing their own weapons, they knew that we meant business. So you better not actually use those things, because we will use them as well. And we know that that would mean devastating consequences for the world. So during this time period, we cut the size of our ground forces of the Army and the Navy, and most of our spending was going toward the Air Force and our nuclear weapon supply. So we had a big shift in military strategy. We wanted to be ready for a World War III at all times, which we don't really have that type of policy anymore. It's been scaled back a bit, I would argue. Moving on to the next slide. This is pretty complex, but I'm going to simplify it as much as possible. So in Iran, Iran was a bit more democratic back in the day than it is today. We know it's a theocracy today. It's essentially a dictatorship based on religious beliefs. So there's no separation of church and state in modern day Iran. There had actually been a revolution in 1979. Before that, we were actually on pretty good footing. But going back even further, in the 1950s, there was a bit of a power struggle. So the Shah, who is technically the leader, more of the royal leader, is on the right, and he was an ally of the United States. On the left, you had the prime minister at the time. The prime minister was trying to wrestle control over the country from the Shah. We did not have a close relationship with the prime minister, and we were actually worried that he had more closer ties with the Soviet Union and communist beliefs. When the prime minister placed all control of the oil industry, which, in case you're not aware, the Middle East is known for the oil industry and oil production. As soon as he placed the oil industry in Iran under the Iranian government's control, that was a red flag for us. One of our allies, Britain, did have many oil fields in Iran that were seized by the Iranian government under the prime minister. So we have formed this group, the Central Intelligence Agency, better known as the CIA, who would do operations overseas. It was kind of a spy agency who would do top secret missions in other countries, as opposed to the FBI, who mainly operates within the borders of the United States. That's a main difference between the CIA and the FBI. CIA does missions outside of the country. The FBI is more secret missions within the country. So the CIA, the United States, actually went over there, and we started the revolution in Iran, and we got the prime minister overthrown. The Shah was restored to power. The United States had a good relationship with Iran, essentially all the way up through the 1970s, when that revolution overthrew the royalty and the Shah and instituted a theocracy that is really a dictatorship. Another thing that the United States did, active in another part of the world, we were also active in Latin America. In Guatemala, you can look at the map, Guatemala being right below Mexico here. So in Guatemala, there was a change in leadership, and the new head of the Guatemalan government seized American-owned land in Guatemala and gave it to peasants. We viewed this as a move very similar to collectivization of farms that was conducted in the Soviet Union under their communist leadership. So anytime you see government seizing property and taking control of that and deciding who can live there, we view that as a communist move. This is very alarming to the United States, especially because it was American-owned land. So these were American-owned businesses growing crops. We had bought this land. It was seized from our own citizens. So we sent the CIA in. We trained a Guatemalan army who was opposed to any type of communist rule or communist overthrow of the Guatemalan government. And this Guatemalan army overthrew the Guatemalan government. So we were able to put a government in charge of Guatemala that would work with the United States, that was opposed to communism. This was all part of the containment policy. We wanted to stop the spread of communism. So we see two examples here. We did it in Iran, where we saw the potential for communism to overtake that country. And we did it in Guatemala, where we saw the potential for communism to overtake that country. Guatemala was especially important to us just because, geographically speaking, it's right in the U.S.'s backyard, and we would actually face a similar threat. Years later, we'd be unsuccessful to stop communism from spreading into Cuba, which is even closer to the U.S. Next slide. In 1956, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt and occupied the Suez Canal. So there was a little dispute between these countries. The Suez Canal is really important because if you look on the map here, you'll notice a little bit of the Mediterranean Sea. So right above Egypt, right below Turkey, that body of water is the Mediterranean Sea. You'll also see the Red Sea between Egypt, Sudan, and then Saudi Arabia. Now there's a little tiny inlet of water, you might notice, that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. That's the Suez Canal. So it was a man-made river, essentially, that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. This is very important for shipping and trade. So if countries want to be able to get back and forth between those bodies of water, you need to go through the Suez Canal. It's the only way to do it. So Egypt had kind of nationalized control of the Suez Canal, and that spurred this British, French, and Israeli invasion. The United States wasn't necessarily opposed to the invasion. They understood why Britain, France, and Israel would be upset if their access to the Suez Canal was being cut off. But it was the fact that the U.S. was not involved in this decision at all. It came as a surprise to President Eisenhower. He heard the news secondhand that, these three countries who were considered allies of the U.S. had invaded Egypt and didn't even talk to us about it beforehand. So we felt left out. We actually put sanctions on those three nations to punish them, meaning we cut off some oil trade with them for a little while, just to let them know, hey, we're not really happy with you right now. You should have talked to us beforehand. We thought you were our allies. They ended up withdrawing their troops, and then we dropped the sanctions. So this really led to something called the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine just being this proclamation that, hey, when it comes to the Middle East, which we would consider this an extension of the Middle East, Northern Africa and Southwest Asia are what we would consider the Middle East. The U.S. would defend the Middle East against any attack by any communist country. So Britain, France, and Israel were not communist countries, but this set a precedent not only if there was a communist threat in the area, if there was any threat to anything going on in the Middle East, the U.S. reserved the right to be involved. And we expected to be involved, and everyone else should expect that as well. Moving on, point number 5 here. So Soviet tanks in 1956 invaded Hungary and fired on protesters. So something from that first PowerPoint we went over was the fact that there were satellite nations. Satellite nations, which are all the ones in green on this map, were essentially controlled by the Soviet Union. So even though you don't see Soviet Union written on East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, we have to understand that during the time period of the Cold War, the Soviet Union really controlled those countries. They did not allow free elections in those countries. They picked the rulers of each of those. And anytime there was an uprising against communist rule, because all those countries in Eastern Europe were under communist rule at this time, anytime there was an uprising against the communist governments or Soviet influence in those areas, the Soviet Union brought in their military to maintain order. So the best example we have of this, and there are a couple examples, it also happened in Poland, but the best example we have is in 1956 when Hungary had a mass uprising against communist rule and Soviet influence. The Soviets brought in the military. There's estimates, and this is all unclear in terms of exact statistics, but estimates are as high as 30,000 Hungarians were killed when the Soviets rolled in with the tanks and just started killing people left and right to stop the protests. You can see in the picture, it was absolutely all-out chaos, and they were able to shut this down pretty quickly. Hungary reached out to the United States for help. Unfortunately, our containment policy was to stop the spread of communism, not to try to mess with communism where it already existed. And we know that going beyond the Iron Curtain into a satellite nation with our military would lead to World War III. So unfortunately, we weren't able to do much, and the Hungarians were left on their own, and they suffered immensely. In 1957, the space race begins. So this becomes a very important part of foreign policy all the way until the end of the Cold War. The Soviets won the first step here. So in 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. This was the first successful satellite launch. So a launch of a satellite, and I know I don't want us to get confused here between space satellites and satellite nations. They're different things. A satellite is when you launch an object into space from Earth and you are able to put it into orbit. So it starts to orbit around the planet. This is really important because if you can do that, you can start to send back signals down to Earth, and you can gain a bunch of relevant scientific data about space. So that's what satellites wanted to do at first, is gain data and eventually start putting people into space, maybe start landing people on other planets or on the moon, which did eventually happen, because who knows what's out there. Maybe you can land people on Mars and dig in there and find, hey, maybe there's oil on Mars, maybe there's gold, maybe there's precious resources. Who knows what kind of riches could be there. So this began the space race to conquer space and to be the first one up there. So there was this constant race to put people into space to land on the moon. As we know, roughly a decade after Sputnik, the United States at least won that part of the space race battle, being the first nation to put man on the moon. In 1960, the Soviet Union brought down an American U-2 plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers. There's a great movie about this starring Tom Hanks. It's called Bridge of Spies. It goes over the East-West Germany divide really well. It shows you the Berlin Wall. It talks about the U-2 incident. It's a great Cold War movie. I've shown it in the past to my classes. I highly recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it. So our spy planes would fly, I believe it was roughly 40,000 feet above the ground. And we thought that if we had spy planes that high above, taking these close-up images over the Soviet Union, trying to spy on them and collect data, we thought they would be undetected. Well, we were wrong. The Soviets shot down one of these planes. There's a lot of controversy over Francis Gary Powers and how we should view him, because our spy pilots were given the order that if you were shot down, you were supposed to inject yourself with poison and kill yourself. You were given orders not to be taken prisoner, because the fear was if our guys were taken prisoner, they could have sensitive confidential information. The Soviets could torture them and get information out of our pilots. So you were ordered, hey, if you get shot down, we're sorry, but you knew the risk going into this. They had little pens. They would just inject it into their leg. It would give them a lethal dose of poison, so they could not be taken prisoner alive. Francis Gary Powers failed to do this. He was taken prisoner as a result. We ended up having to negotiate his release. We did not want him being captive too long, because we didn't want him to squeal a bunch of information that we didn't want the Soviets to know. So we organized a release. We gave the Soviets back some of their spies we had captured, and the Soviets gave us back Francis Gary Powers and also a student who had kind of mistakenly wandered from West Berlin into East Berlin and been taken captive. So this created this precedent that when spies were captured, we would negotiate with the Soviet Union and say, hey, we'll give you so many spies for so many of our spies in return. And that's the key points of this that I wanted to make clear. Hopefully this was helpful. If not, or if there's anything that is still unclear for you, please reach out to me by email and I'll be glad to help. Have a great day.